tonight's panel. I want to first start off and thank our sponsors who make all of our programming possible. The ZAP tax, which is on the ballot. If you haven't voted, please vote for ZAP. It helps fund programs like and lectures like these. The Art Bridges Foundation, that's funding our entire programmatic series for the Memory Show. The Sam and Diane Stewart Family Foundation, the Lawrence T. and Janet D. Foundation, and the Utah Division of Arts and Museums and Utah Humanities. So thank you so much to our sponsors who make this event possible. Throughout the exhibition in memory, I've tried to look at the various angles of what to remember looks like, what it feels like, how it shows up in various contexts. And the theme of migration and exile and displacement shows up in a variety of works, and a lot of my thinking was inspired by an essay by Salman Rushdie called Imaginary Homelands, in which he talks about being in exile and the homeland of his childhood not existing. It exists only in his mind. He calls it Indias of the mind. And this failure to ever really be able to go back home because you've changed and your home has changed and everything has changed. And I think he's talking about that from the perspective of someone that is living in the diaspora. But I also think that there's a through line for many people of what it means in terms of a failure or an inability to truly re-inhabit a homeland in various ways. But I was interested in the way that theme plays out, especially with these makers and scholars, and excited to have Renato lead this discussion. A large part of the structure of this museum and this lecture series has been to bring in other voices. So honored to have Renato leading this, and I wanted to introduce him, and he'll introduce the panelists. So Renato is a proud queer. Sorry, I'll say your full name.
It's fine. It's a mouthful.
Renato it's Olmedo-González is a proud queer. I actually practiced it and then I got scared. He's a proud queer immigrant who's passionate about art and social change. Born and raised in Guadalajara, Mexico, Renato came to the United States as an undocumented immigrant when he was 15 years old. He currently serves as the Public Arts Program Manager for the Salt Lake City Arts Council and acts as the lead curator for public art projects across Salt Lake City. Prior to this, he worked in various roles for Mestizo Institute of Culture and Arts, the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, the Consulate of Mexico in Salt Lake City, and Artistas de Mexico, where he began his professional career. Thank you so much for leading this discussion tonight. I'm very honored to have you here and excited to hear what you have to share. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi.
I also have a loud
I'll introduce our panelists, but
I have a loud voice, so we'll be sharing and you'll be sharing.
so thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for the invitation. If I could make a commercial too, vote for SAP. I think it's an incredibly important thing that it's our responsibility, as residents of Salt Lake County, to support projects like this, institutions like this. I started in an organization that was funded primarily through SAP, and last time I couldn't vote, I wasn't a citizen yet. I became a citizen 2 years ago, and the most excited thing I'm excited about this election is to vote for SAP, so do that, it's really important. All right, so I'm gonna introduce our panelists. We have, and I'm gonna go Christina, Dalila, and Milad. Christina Gibi is an assistant professor of humanities at UVU. She holds a BA in humanities and an MA in comparative studies from Brigham Young University and a PhD in comparative literature with a minor in Hispanic studies from Louisiana State University. She teaches introductory humanities courses, world literature, Caribbean literature, and Latin American humanities. Dr. Gibi's interests include time, memory, history, nature, modern art, and hemispheric American studies. She has published articles and book chapters on Carson McCullers, Sandra Cisneros, Zoe Valdez, Marisa Conde, and Edwidge Dantica. Her first book, Ancestral Voices, Healing Narratives, was released in December 2023, and it analyzes the role of female spirits in contemporary novels from the US and Caribbean. Thank you so much, Dalila. Dalila Sanabria is a Chilean, Colombian, American artist from Central Florida, living in New Haven, Connecticut. She works primarily in sculpture, installation, and video, and her work references domestic sites and sacred architectures, accumulating organic materials and kinetic technologies as catalysts to explore displacement, permanence, and belonging. Currently, she is the 2024-2025 Artist in Residence for the Landmax Project at New York University and a participant of the Interdisciplinary Art and Theory program held in Manhattan, New York. And last but not least, we have Milad Mozari. Milad is an assistant professor in the Multidisciplinary Design program at the University of Utah College of Architecture and Design? And planning. Sorry. Born in Tehran and raised in Salt Lake City, his research-based practice often starts with sound or spatial experiments, which then attempt to resonate physically, historically, and experientially. While studying for his BS in International Studies at the University of Utah, he began to make and exhibit work about language and place. He continued his studies at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, where he received his MFA in the Department of Sound, followed by teaching in the Department of Architecture, Interior Architecture, and designed objects for 5 years, focusing on digital fabrication. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so the way I began to think about the question of memory, displacement, immigrants, people that shouldn't be here, according to many other people, it began to unearth a lot of different types of questions in my mind. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about monuments the last few months. And one of them that really stood out to me, it's not a work here on exhibition here at the University of Utah, at the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art. It's a work by Tania Bruguera. I don't know how many are familiar with her work. She's a Cuban artist who really, one of the primary things that she explores through her work is the issue of belonging, not belonging, primarily through immigrants here in the United States, but also the exile that many people are forced, when they're forced to leave their homeland. She's from Cuba, and she's very critical of that government. She did this project that you're seeing over here in Philadelphia in, I believe, 2017, and it was a temporary commission for several monuments that were dispersed all throughout. But this monument, I was really interested by it because it involves reshaping and redoing something. So I'll explain to you a little bit about what it is, and then I'll tell you what she says about her artwork. So for the monument she did in Philadelphia, it's the Monument to New Immigrants. And she proposes an elevated statue of an immigrant child. The figure was bifurcated vertically with the face and torso of the child left blank and unmarked by race, ethnicity, or gender. The statue was molded from clay but unfired to remain vulnerable to outdoor conditions. So as time went by, the sculpture sort of started to decay. So it began this way, as you can see, it was an unfired clay sculpture outside of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And as time went by, the sculpture itself started to decay. And she had a really poetic face to speak about it. And I'll read a little bit about what she says. The statue represents a kid as a metaphor for what is experienced once you immigrate. No matter how old a person is, they need to start over. The idea behind this statue is not to represent a particular community, but all the immigrants. For this reason, they don't have any specific gender or appearance, and they do not have a face. The lack of facial details is a way to emphasize, I think you can still see it. The lack of facial details is a way to emphasize that sense of precarity that immigrants experience. They are not always in one place. Part of them is somewhere else, in their home country, and their identity is formed by their experience in their new place. The little explanation here in the book says that this poetic series monumentalized arrival, adaptation, loss, and renewal as an allegory of the immigrant experiences in the US. And as we think about memory, I thought about the same way happens in a lot of the artworks. I also was particularly drawn to the material of on-fire clay, something that keeps decaying, and the action and the idea of having to rebuild something. So with this artwork in mind, I want to open up questions for you all. Tania Bruguera's monument to new immigrants requires the artwork to be continuously rebuilt, implying that memory and identity are not static, but constantly evolving. How does this idea of memory as dynamic resonate in your work, especially within the context of displacement or migration? Do you think memory can ever be fully reconstructed, or is it always in a state of reinterpretation? And I don't know if someone wants to take this first.
I'll be anecdotal and start. I have, it's no problem. Is this mic working? Yeah, no, it's, thank you for the question, and thank you for having us. I think for me, this question brought up the notion of molds in the context of how I was thinking about it. And in terms of clay, there's a really fantastic young Japanese artist that passed away working in a kiln in Indonesia by the name of Jin Nishida. And he has these giant ceramic pieces that are partially fired, partially out, but they just kind of like unfold in spaces. And then if you go back historically, there's like the Janine Antoni like knot pieces and the molds that museums had that when they unravel, you have to assemble it back. And that. So it's kind of a reconstruction of knot. And anecdotally, I think with immigrants, there's the mold of being a doctor, lawyer, of family shame. And a lot of times there's a mold or a precedence in terms of what you're supposed to do. But I think what's really beautiful in terms of reconstruction and whatnot, media arts, fine arts, design work, it works off a mold, but then it actually expands into new territory that otherwise may not be the case.
Yeah, I like to see a connection between memory and art. Memory is a reconstruction, that when we remember the past, we are imagining the past. And so memory then is an aesthetic process. And like memory mediating the past and the present, art also can mediate the past and the present. I'm not an artist, but the artist that I'm honored to represent tonight is Ana Mendieta and her Rupestrian sculptures. It's hard in English and Spanish. But Rupestrian, it's an allusion to cave art. And so she was born in Cuba, left in 1961, a couple of years after the revolution. She was sent away by her parents and through Operation Peter Pan. She was 12, and her older sister went with her, 15. Unaccompanied minors, virtually orphans, ended up in Iowa, and in a group home and several foster homes until she ended up at college. Her mother and her brother would eventually join them, but already once she was an adult and established, and her father was a political prisoner in Cuba, and would not be reunited with the family until Ana Mendieta was in her late 20s or so. So there was this idea of an impossible return, which Laura had mentioned already. And when she does finally get to return to Cuba, 19 years after she had left, had been sent away, she does this art project in these caves in Jaruco Park outside of Havana. And she, these images, I don't know if we can pull some of those up so that you can see it, through the style, the execution, and also the material, the medium. In these caves, I see that she's collapsing time, right? Collapsing these temporal boundaries in order to return to a past, not a pre-Castro Cuba, but a pre-Columbian indigenous Cuba. And so maybe just a couple more with, there, that's perfect, yes. And so through these cave sculptures, she is attempting to remember a past that does not exist anymore, that she's imagining a past that she never knew. And so that's how I see this connection between art and memory, both mediating past and present, and the power of imagination in the face of historical rupture, in the face of the trauma of exile, colonial amnesia, etc. That was great. No, it's honestly, hi everyone, by the way, thank you for being here. This question really starts off this entire conversation as we consider place and memory and displacement and exile and permanence, which are sort of really large themes that I constantly revisit and think about in my own work, especially as it pertains to my own personal biography. So, yeah, thanks. Thank you for talking about Ana Mendieta right away. I've always sort of been a long fan of her work. I find it really touching and moving and just like palpably visceral in her relationship with material. And also, Milad, for touching on ceramic as a material and sort of bringing it back to your original question, Renato, and asking us and framing it around Tania Bruguera's work. I was thinking about the unfired clay sculpture of the immigrant child, and thinking about the transient nature of that material. Ceramic is possibly one of, when fired, it's possibly one of the most archival and permanent art materials that we know of. That's how we have an understanding of civilizations. It's from those, ceramic shards that archaeologists can unearth and uncover. So I think that decision to make, to use unfired ceramic always feels very deliberate, in my opinion, and very grounded in its earthenness, in its roots and its source. I think I find a lot of at least like commonality in that sort of decision making when I think about permanence and a material's right to assert itself. And at least for me, my relationship with material has been really interwoven with my personal experience in forced exile and in displacement, and just this notion that a space that you thought was yours is no longer yours. That stance, or I guess my ownership of objects, of its weight, it's always felt really transient.
This carries on to the second question, which is also for you all. So downstairs you'll be able to see the artwork of Ana Mendieta, Dalila, and Milad. And I was really interested in the materials that you all use, because they're not permanent materials. Even a video and sound, like, it requires an action of playing things, it requires you being there, and it's not as permanent. So I have images of the artworks, but let me just maybe begin by asking you all a question about materials, and we can unpack this a little bit more. How do these materials that seem to be so not permanent allow you to explore migration, memory, and displacement? And my question too is, do you think by using these materials in Ana Mendieta's work, performance, nature, documentation, and your work with, specifically over here that we have behind, it's cardboard, and then with you, Milad, your work with video and sound, do you think these materials have that they can carry these themes? How do they do so?
I'll start. Yeah.
I'll start.
Okay, I think you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
The one right before. Perfect. Okay, so with Ana Mendieta, she, in this performance art, she did what she called earth body art. And so her body is the material, natural objects are material, as you can see here. She uses mud and twigs and flowers, etc. So with land art, typically land art is impermanent, and it's about the moment. And she will say specifically how, describing her exile in terms of, in very traumatic terms, of being torn from the womb of nature. And so I find it very interesting that in these earth body works, she's attempting to return to the womb of nature. However, in this one, she's in Mexico. She does these earth body works before she's able to return to Cuba and do the esculturas rupestres, So she's doing these Silueta series in Mexico and in Iowa. So it's not her land, it's not her earth, and yet she's still attempting to reconcile with that. And so I think there's two things going on here. One is that it's this beautiful attempt to heal the rift of the trauma of exile, but at the same time, she's dealing with the issues of impermanence and transience. And I think that says something about wanting to belong, being here and not here, and not having a secure identity, but at the same time, there's something really beautiful about asserting that identity in the moment that is one with nature. And what I love about this specific piece is that it captures that impermanence, inevitability of decay. I can see the cycle of life and death that you imagine. She's using her nude body as material, right? Prostrate on the earth, and out of her body comes life. And I find that really healing, really beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, you had that picture of my work earlier, so I feel the need to maybe address it. The work that's in the show to Quizás. Yeah, so this was a cardboard work. I made it, and sort of a second iteration of a piece I had made in a garage gallery space 3 years ago in Tampa, actually. And yeah, when Laura reached out to me about including that work in the show, I was like, well, it doesn't exist anymore. And sort of working with cardboard or more maybe disposable permanent materials, and also just being a sculptor and working large scale, it's hard to hold on to things. It's something that I've been getting a lot better, or trying to be better about, just as I progress in my career, whatever that means. But yeah, so this was a second iteration of that piece, and cardboard really, I would say, is sort of the first material that I really started investigating when I guess I decided to become an artist. And it became this obsession. It was a natural sort of progression from maybe more traditional art mediums like oil paint into a more grounded and, I was really just curious about what materials could do. And so, dipping cardboard into buckets of water and letting it sort of peel apart and noticing that it's sheets of paper essentially, and then grinding it into pulp and then drying that again, and really trying to understand it at sort of this alchemic level. So a lot of cardboard work happened those early years that I was doing sculpture and object making. And I found a lot of resonance with it in terms of both of its breadth of what you could do with it as a substrate, as paper essentially, and this brown thing, and also for I guess it's sort of like broader thematic qualities in terms of transient and transportation, I made this work, and this was a bookshelf of sorts. It's an architecture of a bookshelf of sorts, and it has a lot of cavities and things inside. And the work was really made in thinking about the belongings that my family had stored in my grandmother's garage for a period of 10 years, that they were waiting out their penalty of deportation from the United States. So when I was 12 years old, and that's kind of the relevant biography here, my father was deported to Colombia, and I was the one who answered the door to the ICE officers, and I was a U.S. born child along with my siblings, but that entirely shifted and shaped the rest of my adolescence. So I moved to Latin America, a place that I couldn't speak the language at the time. I had grown up speaking English. And those years were very difficult ones for my family. These years are made up of moments of impact, and then there's just a shame or that feeling of being forgotten. And so I guess I was thinking about sort of the literal objects of that experience, particularly the books that my parents had kept. When we had to move, it was over a very short period of time, and under those circumstances, very frantic and very rushed. So we could only bring so many things with us in the suitcases, and what we had left behind was largely their book collection. And my mother also kept a very meticulous sort of notebook record listing all of the books and how they were like cataloged. And it reveals a lot of just, their identities as far as people, too, thinking about the titles of those books, and also indicates time as well. There's 2 sets of encyclopedias. We don't use encyclopedias anymore, but that was a thing that we had in our house on our bookshelf. And so, this work was used, the original iteration of the work was using the literal boxes that we had finally unpacked after those period of 10 years. This one was sort of a recreation of that, and some things changed with it too. That first piece was a corner wall, and this one sort of takes up just a front-facing wall, and I was really thinking about topography more and maybe in temple architectures too. So that's sort of a kind of the context around that work.
Can I ask you a follow-up?
Yeah.
So you mentioned something that I haven't thought about an encyclopedia forever, but I did grow up with one. It was in my room, actually. Did the meaning of those objects change when you had to recreate them?
Which ones? The original ones?
The original ones, yeah.
I think so. I mean, I think what happened is that the content kind of matters, and then it didn't. I was just like so aware of just their objectness and the fact that they were kept in their containers too, like just sitting in a garage for 10 years, and sort of affect of what that happens to the paper and the must and the dust around it. And so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think that's why
it seems like you went through a process of forgetting even the meaning of those objects as you were recreating them. I don't know if I'm speaking for you, but that's kind of how I'm listening to it. And I think there's a certain powerful aspect of that, and I think when we were practicing, or not practicing, we were discussing what we were going to bring, some of the ideas that came up, there was some tension around disappointment that we talked about, and I don't know if maybe I'm reading too much into it or reading into that.
I mean, the experiences that the experience I'm describing and the ones we're touching on are complicated ones. I think it's difficult for me to address maybe exactly around my thinking of the books inside the boxes, other than knowing that it was the idea of them sort of circulated in my brain for a while, because I couldn't access them for a while. They were this kind of they were just sitting there for years. And then I moved back to the US when I was 16, and my parents still had to wait out their penalties. So all through my young adulthood, I couldn't see my parents, quite literally. And I would go back to that garage and maybe open a few boxes and try to find something of mine. I would, try to send it to them maybe too. And it's, and then finally when they had moved back in 2019 and we were able to sort of unpack everything, it sort of lost they were just books, dusty old books. And none of us touched them, but they're there now in their new house in Florida, and in this weird period of, back here that we're in right now. But it's interesting how meaning and memory shifts, and the retelling of that also shifts our perception of it. And I think history works in a very similar way. Yeah.
I mean, it's a very personal artwork. It's tied to your experience. So I think that's what makes the aspect of memory, at least to me when encountering it and spending time with it, very interesting. Because I feel like for immigrants, and even going back to the time of Brigada, like there's that constant reinvention. You have to leave who you are and transform in a way. So in a way, like I found that connection with
Yeah,
this
I think I mean, it was very difficult to make this piece again, too, this year, because my work now, I work with sculpture, and it's expanded a lot into just a lot of different materials and videos, and it feels more imaginative, my work lately, in an affective way that I enjoy, actually, because it feels less. A lot of this work was it was memorializing a kind of experience, and it was painful work to make.
Yeah, of course.
And so coming back to it was, it's never comfortable to go back into that headspace, but then I was also really interested in the changes that happened, and there's like weavings with the sort of brown paper part of it. Yeah, and there's like fibrous components that didn't happen in the first iteration that excited me about this time, just sort of like this like added investigation of the material, and that part felt satisfying.
Thank you. Milad, I do wanna ask you a question. So other materials.
Can I just follow up on
Yeah, sure.
disappointment? I don't think it's disappointment, but maybe dissipation. Because it's a lot of times memories land on materials, right? But it loses energy for us, like when you go back.
So when you do something that's symbolic, it was symbolic, it wasn't the value, you know, like.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about like storage spaces across the U.S. Earlier on. Like we both have storage spaces in Chicago, Boston. Yeah, so it's like, and there was a certain prestige to the things in that storage space at some point, but that dissipates as like, I don't know, as you evolve. And I think in terms of, if I may answer the question as well, I think I'm very fortunate that I get to do this work and then also do some work with media making when it comes to the International Rescue Committee. And we were in Missoula, Montana, and there's this community leader by the name of Paul who's from the DRC. And we always ask for permission if we can take photographs. And I said, Paul, I know we just like, man, but do you mind if I just document this? He's like, of course. And he goes on to tell us that when he was fleeing the DRC, he had 2 suitcases, one with like the belongings and the other one with photographs. And all the photographs that he had of his father were in that one suitcase that he left behind. So he wants to document any photograph that he can for his kids of himself as photographs in that realm. So there's certain, the energy may dissipate, but there's a way that the memory actually just is in orbit, or perhaps it persists. And I think materials in the way that is being discussed, and the way in which some of us work, is that the arrangements of them also give agency to not having a colonial gaze on how you arrange these materials. They're not in these like clean taxonomies that are just kind of like prescriptive of like, here's me like categorizing it, but the messiness and the entanglement with the past in the process.
There's a very, it's a Western attitude to want to categorize things by a certain way.
I'm gonna go to the next question, and I think the next question I had prepared, I think we kind of flowed through naturally. But Milad, when we were practicing / preparing, when we were preparing for this for this panel, you spoke about something that really resonated with me, and that was the absence that you tried to portray in your work, where migration or displacement often leaves behind ghostly traces of what was once there. Can you speak more on how you explore what is absent and how that relates to the experience of migration or displacement, where people are often caught between what was and what is to come?
Yes, and I have to say thank you for this question, because a lot of times I bring up absence and people are like, oh, okay. And then they're like impressed by it, but we don't investigate it, so I appreciate this because I had to kind of like do a little bit searching of where I am currently and being present while thinking about absence. And I think for me, I mean, you all know me very well from the bio, which I didn't know what would be said. I started in sound, and I think for me that has this quality of representation of other senses in the process of it. And one thing that I learned in school was about like ghost tones. There's a thing that you convey, but then there's ghost tones of what you can actually also convey in that. And that started for me in terms of just kind of like thinking about studies around looking at different instruments and mimicking those in the realm of those. But as I've gotten older, like the work of like Halim Al-Dal comes to mind, who talks about like sound generating space. I'm curious on what that space is. And for this show specifically, when I was installing, like I heard the William Kentridge piece. I saw your piece. I'm like, oh, I like really need to step it up as like the sound guy, right? And I really wanted to like think about that in the process of the work. And I came to silence as like the conclusion, which I was like, oh, actually like the lack of sound in this space, or the absence of sound, is actually the way that conveys memory the best in this context. Not because of like sound bleeding from one room to the other, because I had a lot of help in terms of like controlling the light in that space, and I feel really fortunate about that. But it was really important for me in terms of actually just thinking about absence, and absence and silence are becoming more of a rhythmic motif for me in the process of this. And I think with the archival stuff, I mean, like these works, these are actually DV tapes that we digitized and then like printed and then laser cut. So they have sound and everything on them, but we just wanted it to be about just like the movement, the choreography that you see. So there is no sound in the process of Ghaffar speaking in Farsi or Mandarin. And I think Ghaffar, in the realm of working with him, this took like 4 years of flying to Beijing and then him sending.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about what the work's about?
Sure, sure, yeah.
Such a fascinating story.
Yeah. So I chased this guy for about 4 years, living in multiple cities. I just found this Azerbaijani Iranian who sees a Beijing opera play in London, because that's where he was studying computer animation. And he quits his academic post and moves to Beijing at the age of 33 to start learning the process. And we all have those friends and family members who always have like a camera with them and they're documenting everything. And Ghaffar is one of those individuals. So there's hundreds of DV tapes that we like pulled out of his Beijing apartment. He teases me still because he still has boxes of DV tapes, and he'll send me a photo of it, like, do you still want like another box? I'm like, yes, bring it in. But then we also did interviews with him during the pandemic when he was in Orange County. And he said something to me, and I think this relates back to like the absence or silence of just like, he's like a mad like he has a mad archive where there's VHS tapes that are just recorded over and over of different performances. So you're like, when you try to transfer it digitally, it's like scrambles. And at the end of one sit-down session, he said, Milad, I think I finally have pulled you into the madness of my archive. I think it's time for you to have like distance. So at that point, I was like, okay, like I have to be somewhat silent in the process of this. Like the Smithsonian has a lot of things around being like agnostic when we work with archives. And I think for me, I was like, I have to just kind of like not say anything in some ways to present this work, but show like the duplicate photos that he has. Like some of those photos he has like 5 copies of, and some of the videos he has a bunch of. And yeah, these were all accumulated from like multiple trips to Beijing. Yeah, so like that one is him in fighting in the dark. But there's like 3 more copies of that photo that he has in his archive. So he has all these things, and I wanted to show somewhat of like the like really fervent way that he's documenting his work, because he's trying to get to this like final movement vocabulary, but he can't. Like right now on WeChat, we're talking about making a video game for him. And he's like, this is reaching the masses. What are we going to do?
He doesn't stop.
He doesn't stop at all. No. Like, I wish there was, in the show, I could show how he text messages. Because it's just like this scroll. And he's the sweetest person.
It's almost like
you'll
an
ever meet.
obsession of not forgetting.
I think it's, as he's gotten older, I mean, if I'm being totally personal and honest, his in the first 3 years, his father developed Alzheimer's, and I would go sleep on the living room floor of their small apartment, and like his father would like burst out, and like there's documentation of his father who used to be a seamster and was really coherent, and as Gafar was in Beijing and they would like video chat, Gafar would try to like sing to him, and he has that archived as well. So it's more of like collective remembering for him in the process, which I think a lot of us try to do. So it's like, what do these artifacts contribute to as a larger field? So memory as a collective act, I think, is part of what he's getting at as well.
I feel like on the follow-up to this panel, we're going to ask you how you choose these specific images
Sure.
to put in the show, because there's so many. Thank you for that. So, Christina, I want to ask you a question, and then I want to open it up to everybody else. Ana Mendieta's Silueta series, which, here I'm going to, sorry, I'm a PC user. Controversial. Ana Mendieta's Silueta series, where her body's imprint in nature is washed away, seems to suggest an impermanence or of presence, a fading memory. How do you interpret her work engaging with the tension between presence and absence, and how does this reflect broader themes of exile and displacement in her life?
I would come back to the trauma of exile and being in that liminal space, this in-between, here and not here. And with the Silueta series, where she's tracing the outline of her body, and sometimes tracing the shadow of herself. And so in that way, it's doubly removed from her physical presence. And it's so haunting, and there's something painful about it, but at the same time, it is still an assertion of self. I think the piece that she did on the beach is extremely profound. It says something about the way that she herself said, I am caught between two cultures and belonging neither here nor there. And being at that shore also, I think, says something about her yearning, her longing for Cuba, that she was always trying to get back, even though she physically it was impossible until 1980 and 1981 when she'd go back and do the cave sculptures. So that, that liminality, that absence and presence. I really love this piece where she's created an ice sculpture of her body. I think this really captures the tension that you were getting at, because even though it's captured in the photograph, you imagine what will happen to that ice sculpture. It's representing her, right? It will melt, it will disappear. And there's something so deeply melancholy about that, but again, there's something that I would say is even triumphant about this act of her Earth Body Works, where it is an assertion of the self, and using nature as a way to reconnect and heal the rift of the trauma of exile.
And then for you all, how do you navigate absence and presence in your work?
Oh my gosh, that question. I feel like there's so much to say around it. How do I navigate absence and presence?
Do you want me to go back?
Sorry?
Do you want me to go back?
I mean, we can. This is the work that's in the show. Yeah, I feel like as an object maker, and and someone who cares a lot about material, I'm constantly thinking about its presence. And also as someone who has this convoluted biography of experiences that I feel just individually I'm constantly sort of unearthing and trying to understand. In that sense, absence then becomes really relevant. Memory is a recurring, I think, topic, inevitably, as I work with organic materials and things that don't feel quite so stable. And I think that, you know, I explained a little bit, you know, of a lot of my thinking around that and sort of the background around this work already. But I just in this conversation, what came to mind was like my initial just sort of like quite visceral reaction to permanence, just beginning to make art, and this kind of like discomfort that I had with even the notion of taking up space in any capacity. It was, and I think, you know, that extended to me just not holding on to a lot of things and like needing to work with cardboard that felt so unassuming. And, you know, and in retrospect, I was like beginning that cardboard work was still in that period of 10 years of my family sort of separated. And thinking back on that, I'm like, okay, well, there's obviously a lot more happening. But at least, I mean, it's interesting to me to now sort of investigate in terms of like why I approach materials the way that I do, and this idea of monument and sculpture, which always felt so just, I don't know, I don't want to use the word pretentious, just so bold. Like, how dare you, what makes you think you can take up this space and have it last forever? And yeah, I think I'm constantly sort of acknowledging that kind of relationship between absence and presence through material choices, through how I'm thinking about organizing space, and you know, it's complicated because now, like in my bio, you know, it says what I'm investigating domestic and sacred architectures, whatever that means. I think about the domestic site a lot. I think about this concept of the home or the hearth in this architectural setting, and things that sort of circulate around a feeling of warmth or of comfort. But then lately also this is extended to these more grander notions of architecture, like a temple, and what does that look like, or what does that assume or pretend to be? And it's both this area that, you know, holds a lot of, it can allow for this, you know, space of reflection or meditation or sense of accessing a transcendental state, but it also, it can be extremely ostentatious. and thinking about ornaments and aesthetics and that way.
And how like architecture specific, I don't know in your work, but like when you're saying certain shapes, certain ways of doing things, doing art, making the art is inviting you to a very specific thing, and a very specific connection, like architecture, like sacred architecture, okay, a steeple, you go there to do something. Yeah,
I mean, a lot of my recent work are literally installations you can walk inside. I'd say over the past few years it's been that. And so making this again and having it be kind of like a wall piece, and it's just kind of asserting its own presence.
It's also an artwork that, unless it ends up in a conservation institution, you know, a museum, it will disappear because it's made out of cardboard. You know, it's a material that's not, it doesn't last forever. So I think there's a certain like, even poetry to it, kind of like going back to the Tani Rivera, the monument, that, I don't know, I find fascinating to think about how you think about the artwork, how you encounter the artwork, how you interact with it, but also to think about the future of it.
No, totally. I would say this out of most of the things I've made is possibly one of the most archival, even though it's cardboard. I like made it in a very specific way, like puzzle piece style, so I could ship it here, which I feel very like proud of. It's like, I mean, it's got like joints and things that just from like a carpentry standpoint I get excited about. But yeah, I mean, and I don't typically make work in that way because it's never felt at least appropriate to prioritize that and you know, throwing like dirt or bread or flour and just a hodgepodge of things and material carries so much narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I work in public art, so like I'm thinking, how can this be the most permanent thing?
Nightmare for
Undestructible. It cannot be destroyed, and that's what we have to think about those things. So thinking about this, it's a completely different game, you know, and like thinking of outdoor sculpture on fire clay. So
yeah.
I found a lot of fun investigating that. What about you, Milad?
I think it varies project to project. I had a very like confrontational experience early on as like a maker, where somebody came into my studio and was like, "What's the notion of permanence in this?" And I took it in the more like poetic sense, and I kind of like, and then I checked with them a year later, and they're like, "How would this like, salt sculpture like stand here like in like a few months?" I was like, "Oh, I took it more in the poetic realm." But I think it varies. Like, I was fortunate enough to work on a renovation project in Chicago of doing the ornamentation of this theater. And one thing that I learned in the process that like engineers and architects will go and do like a hammer test.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
That you have to actually check the integrity of things. So I had to actually work with that. It always goes back to sound. Yeah. And that hammer test process was something I was like, oh, like this has to actually be fabricated and assembled and installed in a way that actually, these ornaments that are like 50 pounds have to stay up that pass the hammer test. So that one was much more about like considering weight and install process to do so. With language of movement, it has to do with a lot of what you see in contemporary like immersive experiences of like embodiment. So the notion of absence, we talked about it for me, was around the silence aspect in the space, but embodiment of like the choreography, the embodiment of seeing the visuals of movement is the notion of presence in this instance.
Thank you. This last question for you all. In your view, how can art serve as a form of resistance or resilience for those who experience displacement? How might this manifest differently in a place like Salt Lake City, where migration narratives are both personal and collective?
I really like what the Martinican author Edouard Glissant and also the Mexican writer Octavio Paz has to say about this. In the face of ruptured history and ruptured histories and identities, the only thing left is art. The only thing left is imagination.
I'll go brief. I was Salt Lake City's never been a monolith, and never will be a monolith, and that's been a guide for me in terms of making work, whether living here or somewhere else. And I think it being, I remember ages ago somebody telling me how Salt Lake City is an immigration hub, and that has to do with just government at the federal as well as the state level propagation that allows for better accommodations in terms of resettlement. During like Salt Lake City in the Mountain West is one of the main hubs for like refugee resettlement. So I think for me, in terms of how it is currently, and then all of the 20th century in terms of migrations here, like people moved talented. So I think in terms of making work here, it's really fertile ground. I think one thing that needs to be maybe gotten rid of is this false division between the east and west side of Salt Lake City.
How does that fall?
I think a lot of people in academia, not that I'm speaking from my employer standpoint, like to in some ways say like, oh, let's go to the west side.
It's very like fetishized in a way.
Yeah, but it's
Where
like
one is the edge of the world.
I was at UNP office for like a media piece we're doing around like a game jam, and they're like talking about them being priced out at like 1700 West. So it's like that doesn't exist, and there were studies done during the pandemic that showed the mortality rate on the west side versus the east side was higher. So those things exist, but in terms of the division, in terms of how it propagates people, it's not the case. A lot of the IRC people, my community, live on the east side as well. So I think that false division could be deconstructed for more resilience within the community. And I think there's a lot of hardship, but there's a lot of good problems to solve that go towards art making, work collaboratively as well.
How does it come, I guess, just a little follow-up question. How do you see art as a vehicle with the communities you work in?
I would say, I'll say the anecdote again in hopes that somebody laughs the second time. Like with immigrant or refugee communities, we talk about how there's like 3 jobs you could have, like doctor, lawyer, or family shame. And thank you for the paid laughter there.
Do you think that's part of the specific, like the narrative of the successful immigrant in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think for me, like, I remember my parents, like, growing up, thank God they're not here right now. They're like, what are you doing? I'm like, what are you, sound dog? Like, what are you doing? And then I remember vividly my mother, like, telling somebody, like, later on, and like, I told him to follow his dreams. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you've never said that. And I think it's the limited scope a lot of times that when you relocate, you have, especially if you're a younger person, you have the family on your back to carry. So, and I think there just needs to be a little bit more exposure in terms of there are career pathways. There are options, right? And it's I think, I know for me, like, coming across, like, Halim Al-Dab taught at Oberlin, I think, till he passed away. Like, you just need more community members to give you permission to do the thing that you want. And I think art, design, any making process, if it feels natural to you and you feel intuitively drawn to it, it's inevitable that you'll get good at it. So I think that's part of something that needs to be just. Did that answer your question? Yeah. That felt like group therapy as well. I apologize.
It always happens. It's just, what you're saying is very true, and I think me as a Mexican immigrant, it's like my job options are, you know, a cook, you know, it's very different. It's not doctor, and it's not that my mom didn't tell me those things. It's what society told us, and it's what we're reminded of constantly. And I think it's interesting because there's the narrative of the successful immigrant that we see, and then there's the reality of the immigrants holding these jobs because they're, I don't want to say forced to, but they end up in those jobs because of the political situation in which we end up at, you know, like all of those different sets of external forces. And,
it's where, like, opportunity seems to be their reach, right, which is not the case.
if we immigrants, like, I mean, if one moves here, if one gets a job, you know, gonna bring everybody else, and then it's just chain, you know. And when I worked at a consulate, I saw it a lot. I think it's interesting to like keep unpacking, but I do appreciate the fact that there's the options too, because people move here and say, you're not gonna make money out of making sound art and buy a house, you know, like.
No comment still on that topic.
What are you gonna do? I don't know.
I'm sorry.
remember the initial question.
Oh,
But I guess on this topic of migration. I think you asked about it sort of.
art as a form of like resistance and a form of resilience
Yeah.
against displacement or immigration.
Yeah. I think I always have difficulty like assuming any kind of collective influence. That being said, I've always felt a certain urgency around making the work that I make and the narrative that informs it. And I think, I think that comes from a lot of different places and in terms of what it feels like to be sort of a forgotten citizen or an exile. And having that confusing relationship between several nationalities and being a kind of emigrant in all of those places.
I mean, you immigrated.
Yeah, I mean, I was born in the US, but then I immigrated to Colombia at 12, and then I also lived a year in Chile and did 7th grade there. And so I have my citizenship, it crosses a lot of different places. And then I came back here and, my relationship to those places is complex. It was initially met with resentment and confusion and feeling just, very forgotten and not understanding where I was and how to speak with people that looked like me, but I couldn't speak like them. And then as an adult and sort of coming into myself, now really like longing for those places again and trying to understand them and getting down to the roots of these geographies and their histories and the indigeneities of them too, and trying to get to the soul of this place. And so, I don't know, broadly speaking, what I'm touching at here, but I don't know, I think work as a form of resistance, maybe it's work that just comes from an individual place that happens to be a different narrative.
Well, you just said in random, like Ana Mendieta too, it's like, couldn't go to Cuba, so I will do it in Mexico, which is, it's a Latin America by proxy in a way. It's super interesting.
Well, and she would say that it was like a surrogate homeland. She felt more comfortable in Mexico than in Iowa because people look like her, right? And she said something about them being the same size as her too. But eventually she was able to return home.
Do we have questions? Are you open for questions from people?
I am, yeah. I could also hear Milad talk forever.
No. Please don't. Please don't.
Of course I have a question. So you keep, as I've been taking notes, I keep hearing you saying, you've been very pointed, I guess, at saying that the work that is here is, the work of the past, and we haven't really heard you talk. I mean, we mentioned a little bit about the installation pieces that you are doing now. But I would especially like to hear how you, if there is a sort of cardboard chain from this to, for example, the installation that's in Dallas right now, would you kind of walk us through?
Just like the evolution of the word?
Yeah, and I only bring up this question because you've been so pointed to say not in a bad way. I don't want you to
like I'm making all work.
No, but it's a revisiting here.
Yeah.
And then there's such a presence, in public settings.
Yeah.
Where you are now. So it's an interest. Anyway.
Well, I guess to like describe a little bit, give context to the Dallas piece that I just installed in September in an outdoor sculpture park. It's this large concrete volcanic doomsday bunker that's solar generated with a propane tank on top that's like lit on fire. It's ridiculous. Oh my god. On my website. It's on my website. I don't know if you have internet there. Which definitely has a lot of presence. One of the most permanent things I've made because it's literally concrete. I mean, a lot of the work is very layered. Like that week, Ruca that you're describing references a Chilean Mapuche indigenous house structure, that Rucas, they're their homes, they're these thatched roofs, they're conical in the roof. You can just go to my website and just click on Ruca. But it's, and they're very like cosmological in their arrangement, so they're always facing east. These houses, so click on work. That's another work. That was my, another ridiculous thing. That was very large. Ruca. Yeah, that one. So this is the work you're describing. And you can kind of just like, there's the video there as far as like a little walkthrough. There's no sound, so it kind of works.
Hey, there's no sound.
I know. I should put sound. Mostly you can just kind of like hear the fire from the propane tank, and inside there's plywood. But yeah, Rucas, they face east because where the sun rises. They're cones because the cone is believed to sort of be this like sacred, architectural, sort of more spiritual form. And the concrete mix is custom. The concrete you can kind of make out of anything, like any aggregate, as long as you have cement in it. So it has like sand and gravel from the park, and straw and sticks. It's stained with acid etchings of like copper sulfate and iron oxide. There's exposed rebar and rusted wire. The whole thing is just kind of this massive sort of mutant crater. And it's solar generated that's powering the sort of inside shop light that you can just kind of click on and off. And there's a fire at the top. And these rucas, they're all inside, everything's arranged around a central hearth, like a fireplace. And thinking about like the sacredness of that. And that's it at night. And I guess this piece definitely became a much bigger sort of assertion of presence. And I feel that, it's layered in this way, materially, and the rim is also, so I made these tiles cast from branches in the park, so that's the striated tiles are all around the sort of front door frame as well. And I guess I was really thinking about like the doomsday bunker in terms of this like shelter anticipating cataclysm, and the volcano also as a geography or topography that indicates that sort of potential for eruption, but also its potential for regeneration as well. And I found a lot when I was thinking about these themes, it sort of made sense to like, mush them together. And this work happened at the same time as the piece that's in New York right now, which is the Ghost Party spaceship. That's also really ridiculous.
Is it here?
Yeah, it's called This Will Pass. This is the show that's still up until December. So this is using like bent laminated wood and Spanish moss and woven palm leaves from my home in Central Florida, and a bunch of LED lights, and inside it's aluminum, and there's like this rotating disco ball from like silicone and glass and mirror shards, and then I also created the wall and put this video inside of some friends that are here right now actually, dancing in the salt flats for me. Then there's that work is also referencing a story, the ghost ship that was known for, it was in Chile as well, and it's a party ship that would come in and out, and you'd hear the glowing lights and music, so it was this kind of celebrative tale of a state of kind of, in between states for me, and thinking about a kind of purgatory and this more sort of joyful affect, and it's its own kind of sort of migrant vessel. But,
So you put those together while you were
I know. Basically I made 3 things this year, and it was the piece that's here, the piece at the beginning, and then I made those 2 over the summer, and they just installed them like very recently, and now I'm just kind of coming out of that. been like bread and mud and a lot of things in between that, and it just kind of evolved from cardboard. Yeah, very sensorial, kind of thinking about materials. Yeah. I wasn't expecting to talk about all the other work, but there it is.
Don't be shy. Susan.
Hi. So I love your work. I love what you talked about in the materials, the encyclopedias, and the memories that come with these things. And I remember we never got like fun things when I grew up. We got encyclopedias, but I do remember how fun it was looking through them, the anatomy, the plastic anatomy pages. But now that everything's digital and it's not ours, it's online, I mean, how are we still going to have these same types of memories? And are they going to be imbued with such significance? So much that we see here is paper. It's old diaries. It's calendars.
Yeah.
It's the things that you're showing. But what happens when everything is just on the internet that we may or may not be able to access again?
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation, but I hear you in terms of those encyclopedias. Like I have very like vivid memories of going through like the dog pages and the cat food pages.
Oh, yeah.
They have little like pictures. And so if I like open those back up from those boxes, those, yeah, they have like crayons all over them too, but anyway, it's of a time, at least for me. And yeah, it's difficult to think about the digital world and record keeping and an archive and artifact.